The maps existed. The plans were written. The administrative structures were designed. When we ask what Europe would have looked like under a German victory in World War II, we're not engaging in pure speculation. Nazi leadership spent years developing detailed blueprints for reorganizing the European continent under their control. These documents survived the war, and they reveal a vision far more complex and horrifying than simple military occupation. The political order Nazi Germany planned to impose on Europe was not a temporary wartime arrangement. It was intended as a permanent restructuring of the continent that would last for what Hitler called 1,000 years. Understanding this planned order requires examining actual Nazi policy documents, implementation in occupied territories during the war, and the ideological framework that drove these plans. The Generalplan Ost, the master plan. At the center of Nazi plans for a reordered Europe was the Generalplan Ost, or General Plan for the East. This wasn't a single document, but rather a series of planning papers developed between 1939 and 1942 by various Nazi agencies, primarily the Reich Security Main Office under Heinrich Himmler. The Generalplan Ost outlined the systematic depopulation and Germanization of Eastern Europe over a period of 25 to 30 years following German victory. The plan called for the removal of between 31 and 45 million people from Poland, the Western Soviet Union, and other Eastern European territories. Removed, in this context, meant a combination of deportation to Siberia, reduction through deliberately induced famine and disease, and outright extermination. The territories vacated through this massive demographic engineering would be resettled by German colonists. The plan envisioned the creation of a series of Germanic settlement zones stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, with fortified settlements serving as strong points of German power deep into what had been Soviet territory. These weren't the fevered dreams of fringe ideologues. The Generalplan Ost was developed by academics, bureaucrats, and planners who approached the task with bureaucratic thoroughness. One of the key figures was Professor Konrad Meyer, an agricultural scientist who headed the planning division of the Reich Commissioner for the Strengthening of Germandom. Meyer's team produced detailed studies of carrying capacity, agricultural productivity, and settlement patterns for the conquered Eastern territories. The plan categorized populations in the Eastern territories into groups based on their perceived racial value. Those deemed sufficiently Germanic in appearance and culture might be re-Germanized through education and cultural indoctrination. The majority, however, were designated for removal or reduction. The few who remained would serve as an enslaved labor force for German settlers. Implementation had already begun during the war. In occupied Poland, hundreds of thousands of Poles were expelled from Western Polish territories incorporated directly into the Reich. German settlers, many ethnic Germans repatriated from the Baltic states and elsewhere, were moved into the seized farms and homes. This was Generalplan Ost in microcosm, a preview of what Nazi planners intended across Eastern Europe. The tiered system of control. Nazi plans for Europe didn't envision uniform occupation everywhere. Instead, they designed a complex, tiered system where different territories would have different statuses based on their perceived racial and strategic value. At the top tier were territories considered suitable for direct incorporation into a greater Germanic Reich. This included not just Germany proper and Austria, but also territories with significant ethnic German populations or areas deemed essential for German security and economic interests. Western Poland, called the Warthegau, had already been incorporated into the Reich during the war. Under a German victory scenario, additional territories would follow. Parts of northern France, including Alsace-Lorraine, would be annexed. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and eventually Scandinavia would be absorbed into the Greater Germanic Reich, though this might happen gradually through confederation structures that provided a facade of autonomy while ensuring German control. The second tier consisted of satellite states. These would be nominally independent nations with their own governments, but firmly under German domination. France, under this scheme, would likely retain a collaborationist government similar to Vichy, but extending over the entire country. This government would have limited sovereignty, conducting certain domestic affairs while deferring to Germany on all matters of foreign policy, defense, and economic policy that affected German interests. Several such satellite states already existed during the war and provide models for what Nazi planners envisioned. Slovakia, under Joseph Tisso's clerical fascist government, was nominally independent but utterly subordinate to German direction. Croatia, under the Ustaša regime of Ante Pavelić, operated with somewhat more autonomy but remained dependent on German military support and economic ties. The third tier comprised territories under direct German military administration. These were regions deemed too strategically important or too hostile to German rule to permit even puppet governments. Much of the occupied Soviet Union fell into this category during the war. Ukraine, Belorussia, and the Baltic states were divided into Reich commissariats, administrative units governed by German civilian commissioners backed by military force and police apparatus. Under a German victory, this system of commissariats would have been formalized and expanded. Reichskommissariat Ostland, covering the Baltic states and parts of Belorussia, and Reichskommissariat Ukraine were both established during the war. Plans existed for additional commissariats covering the Caucasus, Central Asia, and even territories beyond the Urals. The commissariats were not intended as permanent arrangements. Nazi planners viewed them as transitional structures that would gradually give way to direct incorporation into the Reich as Germanization progressed. But this process was projected to take decades, during which these territories would remain under harsh occupation characterized by resource extraction, forced labor, and continued population reduction. At the bottom tier were territories designated for indefinite occupation and exploitation without any pretense of political structure. Much of the Western Soviet Union fell into this category in Nazi planning. These areas would be systematically stripped of resources, their populations reduced to subsistence level or below, and their land prepared for eventual German colonization. The fate of individual nations. Understanding the planned new order requires looking at what Nazi planners intended for specific countries. The fate envisioned for each nation depended on racial theories, strategic considerations, and the degree of resistance encountered during the war. France occupied a complex position in Nazi planning. Hitler had mixed feelings about France. He admired certain aspects of French culture and saw potential value in co-opting French industrial capacity and colonial resources. At the same time, he viewed France as a historic enemy that needed to be permanently weakened. Under a German victory, France would likely have retained formal independence under a collaborationist government, probably an expanded version of the Vichy regime. However, significant territories would be lost. Alsace-Lorraine would be annexed to Germany. The industrial regions of northeastern France might come under direct German economic control. France's colonies would be subject to German oversight, with Germany controlling strategic territories and resources. The French government would operate under severe constraints. Its military would be limited to internal security forces. Foreign policy would be dictated from Berlin. The economy would be organized to serve German interests, with French industry producing goods for the German market and French agriculture feeding German cities. France would become, in effect, a German economic satellite with a French administrative facade. Britain presented the most challenging case for Nazi planners because Britain never surrendered and wasn't fully occupied during the war. Nazi plans for Britain varied depending on when they were formulated and how optimistic German leadership felt about achieving British submission. Early war plans, developed when Germany expected a negotiated peace with Britain, envisioned Britain retaining its independence and even its empire in exchange for accepting German hegemony in continental Europe. Hitler admired the British Empire and saw Britain as a potential partner in dividing global influence, with Germany dominating Europe and Britain retaining its overseas territories. Later plans, developed after Britain refused to negotiate and fought on, were harsher. Some documents suggest Germany would have installed a puppet government under fascist sympathizers like Oswald Mosley. Britain would have been forced to disarm, pay reparations, and accept German oversight of its foreign and economic policies. The British Empire would have been gradually dissolved, with Germany and its allies seizing key territories. The most extreme plans, developed by hardline Nazis frustrated by British resistance, envisioned treating Britain similarly to occupied Eastern European territories. Mass deportations, population reduction, and eventual German colonization were contemplated. However, these extreme scenarios were less detailed than the Generalplan Ost, suggesting they remained more in the realm of vengeful fantasy than practical planning. Poland had no ambiguity in Nazi planning. Poland would cease to exist as a political entity. The Western territories, areas Germany had lost after World War I plus additional lands, would be incorporated directly into the Reich and completely Germanized. The remaining territory would become a general government, essentially a labor reservoir for the German economy. This wasn't theoretical. Nazi Germany had already implemented this division during the war. Under a German victory, the process would simply continue to its logical conclusion. The Polish population would be reduced through starvation, deportation, and killing. Polish culture would be systematically eradicated. Education beyond basic literacy would be forbidden. The surviving population would serve as agricultural laborers and industrial workers under German supervision. Nazi planners were explicit about their intentions for Poland. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, stated in 1940 that Poland would be treated as a colony and the Poles reduced to the status of slaves. This wasn't rhetoric. It was implemented policy that would have continued and intensified under a German victory. The Soviet Union faced the most catastrophic fate under Nazi planning. The Generalplan Ost devoted the most attention to Soviet territories because Nazi ideology viewed the conquest and colonization of the East as Germany's primary objective. The Soviet Union would be completely dismantled. Western portions would be organized into Reichskommissariats as transitional administrative units. The Russian population would be reduced by tens of millions through deliberate starvation policies. The plan called for blockading or destroying Soviet cities, forcing urban populations into the countryside where insufficient food supplies would lead to mass death. Leningrad was to be completely destroyed, its population killed or driven into the wilderness. Moscow would be flooded by diverting rivers, creating an artificial lake where the city once stood. This wasn't military necessity. It was ideological destruction, erasing symbols of Slavic civilization to clear the ground for Germanic colonization. The surviving Russian population would be driven east of the Urals into Siberia. Nazi planners envisioned a permanent frontier line, possibly along the Ural Mountains or even further east at the Yenisei River, beyond which remnants of Slavic populations would be contained. Whether these populations would be left to their own devices or subject to continued German military pressure varied in different planning documents. Non-Russian Soviet peoples faced different fates depending on Nazi racial theories. The Baltic peoples, deemed more Germanic, would undergo forced Germanization. Some portion of the population would be absorbed into the German Reich. The rest would be deported. Ukraine presented a complex case. Some Nazi planners saw Ukrainians as potential collaborators against Russia, while others viewed them as Slavs to be eliminated like Russians. The result was inconsistent policies that would likely have remained confused under a German victory. The Caucasus region interested Nazi planners for its oil resources. Plans existed for establishing a German protectorate over the region, possibly retaining some local administrative structures to facilitate resource extraction. Central Asia was largely ignored in detailed planning, suggesting it might have been left as a buffer zone or subject to eventual future colonization. Scandinavia occupied a favored position in Nazi racial thinking. Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes were considered fellow Germanic peoples who should be incorporated into the Greater Germanic Reich. However, implementation would proceed carefully to avoid unnecessary resistance. Norway and Denmark, already occupied during the war, would gradually be absorbed into the Reich through a process of confederation. Local institutions would be retained but subordinated to German oversight. Fascist or Nazi-sympathetic local leaders would be promoted to positions of authority. Over time, through economic integration, cultural propaganda, and generational change, these countries would become indistinguishable from German provinces. Sweden, which remained neutral during the war, presented a different case. Nazi planners assumed Sweden would recognize German hegemony and align its policies accordingly without requiring occupation. Sweden's industrial capacity, particularly its iron ore, was valuable enough that Germany preferred a compliant neutral Sweden to an occupied and potentially resistant one. However, if Sweden resisted German pressure, occupation was certainly contemplated. Italy was Germany's primary ally, but the relationship was complex and often tense. Under a German victory, Italy would retain formal independence and its fascist government under Mussolini or his successors. However, Italy's status as a great power would be fictional. Germany would be the dominant partner, making all significant strategic decisions. Italy's sphere of influence would be limited to the Mediterranean region, and even there, subject to German oversight. The Balkans, where Italy and Germany competed for influence during the war, would ultimately fall under German control. Italy might retain its African colonies and possibly gain additional territories in North Africa, but these would be compensation prizes rather than symbols of genuine power. The administrative apparatus. The political new order required an administrative structure to implement and maintain control. Nazi Germany had already developed this apparatus during the war, and its expansion under a victory scenario can be extrapolated from existing institutions. The SS, Heinrich Himmler's paramilitary and police organization, would have been the primary instrument of control across occupied Europe. During the war, the SS had already expanded far beyond its origins as Hitler's personal guard force. It operated concentration camps, administered occupied territories, ran economic enterprises, and fielded its own military divisions. Under a German victory, the SS would have become even more powerful, possibly eclipsing the traditional state bureaucracy. Himmler envisioned the SS as a racial and ideological elite that would govern the Germanic Empire. SS officers would serve as administrators, police commanders, and settlement supervisors throughout the occupied territories. The Reich Security Main Office, or RSHA, would coordinate security and intelligence operations across Europe. This organization, which had orchestrated the Holocaust during the war, would continue its racial and political persecution in peacetime. The RSHA's networks of informers, security police, and special task forces would monitor occupied populations for resistance and ensure compliance with German policies. Economic administration would fall to various agencies competing for control. Hermann Göring's four-year plan organization claimed authority over economic exploitation of occupied territories during the war. Albert Speer's Ministry for Armaments and War Production controlled industrial output. The conflicts between these agencies created inefficiency during the war and would likely have continued under a victory scenario, unless Hitler or his successor imposed clearer lines of authority. The German Labour Front, led by Robert Ley, would organize workers across occupied Europe. This organization would replace independent labor unions, controlling wages, working conditions, and labor allocation. The Labour Front's purpose was not to advocate for workers, but to maximize production for the German state while preventing any collective worker action that might threaten German control. education and propaganda would be controlled by the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels. This ministry would extend its operations across occupied Europe, controlling newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, and schools. The goal would be indoctrination of younger generations in territories designated for Germanization and suppression of national consciousness in territories designated for exploitation. Collaborationist governments and the politics of collaboration. No occupation can succeed through force alone, particularly across a continent as large as Europe. Nazi planners understood this, which is why they invested considerable effort in cultivating collaborationist movements and establishing puppet governments in occupied territories. Collaboration took many forms. In some cases, it involved pre-existing fascist movements that shared Nazi ideology and welcomed German domination as an opportunity to seize power. In other cases, it involved conservative elites who saw collaboration as the least bad option for preserving some degree of national autonomy. In still other cases, it was pure opportunism by individuals seeking power and enrichment. The Vichy regime in France, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, exemplified collaboration by conservative elites. Pétain and his supporters believed France had been corrupted by democracy and that German victory offered an opportunity for authoritarian renewal. Vichy France cooperated extensively with German occupation, implementing anti-Jewish legislation, suppressing resistance, and providing economic resources to Germany. Under a German victory, the Vichy model would likely have been extended across France and replicated in other countries. Norway's Vidkun Quisling gave his name to the very concept of collaboration. Quisling, who led a small Norwegian fascist party, welcomed the German invasion and was installed as head of a puppet government. His administration had limited popular support and relied entirely on German backing. Under a German victory, regimes like Quisling's would have been formalized as permanent governments, though they would remain subordinate to German interests. Eastern Europe saw particularly brutal forms of collaboration. The Ustasha regime in Croatia, led by Ante Pavelic, implemented genocidal policies against Serbs, Jews, and Roma that shocked even some German officials. This regime demonstrated the extreme violence that collaborationist governments could unleash when given power by German occupation. The Baltic states produced numerous collaborators, including military units that fought alongside German forces. Some Baltic nationalists saw German occupation as liberation from Soviet rule and hoped to achieve independence under German patronage. They would have been disappointed. Nazi plans for the Baltic states involved Germanization, not independence, but collaborators would have been useful tools in the interim. In the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany attempted to exploit ethnic and political divisions. The Russian Liberation Army, led by captured Soviet General Andrei Vlosov, fought against the Soviet Union in the war's final years. Ukrainian nationalists initially welcomed German forces as liberators from Stalin's rule. These collaborationist movements would have been cultivated under a German victory, though ultimately betrayed as Nazi racial ideology precluded genuine partnership with Slavic peoples. Collaboration was always a devil's bargain. Collaborators hoped to preserve some autonomy or achieve their own political objectives by working with German occupation. Nazi Germany encouraged these hopes when useful, but had no intention of honoring them. The long-term Nazi vision left no room for genuine national independence in territories designated for German domination. Religious institutions under the new order. Religion posed a complex challenge for Nazi planners. Nazi ideology was fundamentally opposed to Christian universalism, which conflicted with racial hierarchy. Yet the churches were powerful institutions with deep roots in European society. Frontal assault risked creating martyrs and hardening resistance. Nazi policy toward Christianity was inconsistent and evolved over time. Some Nazi leaders, including Hitler himself, viewed Christianity as incompatible with Nazi ideology and anticipated its eventual replacement by a form of neo-paganism or racial mysticism. Others, including many in the SS, actively promoted these alternative belief systems. However, pragmatism often prevailed over ideological purity during the war. The Catholic Church presented a particular challenge. As a supranational institution with its center in Rome, the Church couldn't be easily subordinated to German control. During the war, the Vatican maintained official neutrality, while the Church in occupied territories faced varying degrees of persecution. In Poland, clergy were targeted for arrest and killing. In France, the Church largely accommodated itself to Vichy collaboration. Under a German victory, the fate of the Catholic Church would have depended on its response to German demands. A church that accommodated Nazi political control while ceasing to advocate universalist principles might have been tolerated, at least temporarily. A church that resisted would have faced systematic persecution. Given the Church's historical tendency toward self-preservation through accommodation with secular power, the former seems more likely, though individual clergy and Catholic communities would have resisted regardless of official policy. Protestant churches in Germany had already largely been subsumed into the German Christian movement, which attempted to reconcile Christianity with Nazi racial ideology. This model would have been exported to Protestant regions of occupied Europe. Churches would be organized under German supervision, clergy who resisted would be removed, and theological education would be controlled to ensure compatibility with Nazi ideology. In the long term, Nazi ideologues planned for Christianity's gradual obsolescence. SS indoctrination programs emphasized pre-Christian Germanic traditions. SS wedding and naming ceremonies were designed as alternatives to Christian sacraments. These practices would have been promoted more aggressively in peacetime, particularly in territories being Germanized where the goal was complete cultural transformation. Eastern Orthodox Christianity presented a different case. In occupied Soviet territories, Nazi policy toward the Orthodox Church was initially pragmatic. German authorities sometimes allowed churches to reopen after decades of Soviet suppression, recognizing that this generated goodwill among the population. However, this tolerance was temporary. Long-term Nazi plans for the East included elimination of organized religion along with other aspects of Slavic culture. Islam and other non-Christian religions were viewed through the lens of racial rather than theological categories. Nazi planners showed little interest in Muslim populations of the Balkans and Caucasus beyond their potential utility as collaborators against common enemies. These populations would likely have been left largely alone so long as they didn't resist German domination. Economic integration and exploitation. The political new order was inseparable from economic reorganization. Nazi Germany conceived of Europe as an economic space organized for German benefit. This wasn't simply military plunder, but a systematic restructuring of economic relationships designed to channel resources, labor, and industrial output towards serving German needs. During the war, Germany already implemented many elements of this economic reorganization. Occupied territories were required to pay for the costs of their own occupation through requisitions and occupation payments. Raw materials and agricultural products were seized for the German war economy. Factories in occupied territories were converted to produce goods for Germany. Millions of foreign workers, both volunteers and forced laborers, were brought to Germany to work in agriculture and industry. Under a victory scenario, these temporary wartime measures would have been formalized into a permanent economic structure. Germany would be the industrial and financial center of Europe. Occupied and satellite territories would serve as sources of raw materials and markets for German manufactured goods. This was, in essence, a continental-scale mercantile system with Germany in the metropolitan role and the rest of Europe subordinated as colonial dependencies. The Reichsmark would become Europe's currency, or at least the currency to which all other European currencies were pegged. Exchange rates would be set to favor German trade. Capital flows would be controlled to ensure German financial dominance. The Reichsbank would function as Europe's central bank, dictating monetary policy across the continent. Agricultural production would be organized to feed Germany first. The fertile agricultural regions of France, Poland, and Ukraine would be treated as Germany's breadbasket. Food would flow toward Germany, while occupied populations received whatever remained. During the war, this policy led to severe food shortages and starvation in occupied territories. Under a victory scenario, it would continue indefinitely. Industrial production would be rationalized according to German planning. Heavy industry would be concentrated in Germany, and selected satellite territories under German control. Occupied territories would specialize in providing raw materials or performing low-value-added manufacturing. This would prevent potential rivals from developing independent industrial capacity that could support military resistance. Labor would be the most mobile resource in this economic system. The millions of foreign workers already in Germany would become a permanent underclass. Additional workers would be recruited or coerced from occupied territories as needed. The SS planned to establish labor camps throughout the East where Slavic populations would be worked in agriculture and construction projects until no longer useful. Cultural control and the elimination of national identity. Political control required cultural control. Nazi planners understood that eliminating national consciousness in occupied territories was essential for long-term stability of their new order. This required systematic attack on language, history, education, and cultural institutions. In territories designated for Germanization, native languages would be suppressed. Schools would teach only German. Publications in native languages would be banned. Street signs, official documents, and all forms of public communication would use German exclusively. Over 1 or 2 generations, native languages would survive only in private family settings, if at all. History would be rewritten to serve German narratives. Textbooks would teach that the various European peoples had always been subordinate to Germanic leadership, that previous periods of independence were aberrations, and that current German domination represented a return to natural order. National heroes of occupied peoples would be denigrated or erased from collective memory. Cultural institutions like universities, museums, and theaters would be reorganized under German supervision. University professors who refused to adapt their teaching to Nazi ideology would be removed. Museums would be required to emphasize Germanic contributions to civilization while minimizing or eliminating coverage of native national achievements. Theaters would perform approved works that promoted Nazi values while censoring works that celebrated national independence or democratic ideals. The physical landscape would be altered to erase national memory. Monuments to national heroes would be demolished. Buildings associated with national independence movements would be destroyed or repurposed. Cities would be renamed with German names. Warsaw, for instance, was slated to be completely rebuilt as a German city, erasing all evidence of its Polish character. This cultural genocide would proceed at different rates in different territories. In Poland and the occupied Soviet territories, it would be immediate and total. In Western Europe, it might proceed more gradually, maintaining a facade of respect for local culture while systematically undermining and replacing it over decades. Resistance to cultural elimination would be treated as political resistance and suppressed accordingly. Teaching children their native language, celebrating traditional national holidays, or maintaining national cultural practices would be criminal offenses subject to severe punishment. The goal was not merely political control, but the complete erasure of national identities that might form the basis for future resistance. The question of stability. The political New Order Nazi Germany planned for Europe raises an obvious question. Could it have lasted? The answer depends partly on how complete German victory was assumed to be, and partly on the resistance such an order would inevitably generate. If we assume a scenario where Britain negotiated peace and the United States remained neutral, German control over continental Europe might have been militarily sustainable in the short to medium term. The massive German military, no longer engaged in active warfare, would have been available for occupation and suppression of resistance. The SS and police apparatus would have expanded to monitor and control occupied populations. However, ruling a hostile continent through force alone would require permanent mobilization of massive security resources. Guerrilla resistance would be ongoing, requiring continuous counterinsurgency operations. Even with brutal repression, resistance movements would persist, particularly in territories like Poland and the Western Soviet Union where Nazi policies were most extreme. Economic exploitation would generate its own resistance. Populations reduced to subsistence level or below have little to lose and strong motivation to resist. The very policies designed to benefit Germany would create conditions fostering continuous unrest. The cultural elimination programs would face resistance from people determined to preserve their identities. Languages suppressed in public would be maintained in private. History erased from official texts would be preserved in oral tradition and hidden documents. Cultural practices banned by German authorities would be continued in secret. Over longer time frames, the system would face additional challenges. Generational change might reduce resistance as people born under German occupation knew nothing else. But it might also create new forms of resistance as educated elites in occupied territories, even those educated in German systems, developed their own critiques of the occupation. The system's sustainability would also depend on its own internal dynamics. Nazi Germany was characterized by overlapping authorities, personal rivalries among leaders, and ideological fanaticism that often overrode practical considerations. These tendencies produced inefficiency and irrationality during the war. They would likely have continued in peacetime, potentially weakening the system from within. Hitler's death would have created a succession crisis. No clear mechanism existed for transferring power, and multiple Nazi leaders had competing claims and power bases. A succession struggle might fracture the system or lead to a military coup that abandoned some of the more extreme Nazi policies in favor of more conventional authoritarian rule. Conclusion. The political New Order Nazi Germany plan for Europe was comprehensive, detailed, and horrifying. It wasn't simply military occupation, but a complete restructuring of the continent designed to serve German interests at the expense of everyone else. The plans were genocidal, particularly in Eastern Europe, where Nazi ideology called for elimination of existing populations and replacement with German colonists. These plans were not secret. They were openly discussed among Nazi leadership and in some cases publicly proclaimed. Implementation had already begun during the war in occupied territories. What we know about the planned new order isn't speculation. It's extrapolation from documented policies and implemented actions. The political structure would have been complex, with different territories subject to different forms of control ranging from direct annexation to puppet governments to military occupation. All would serve the ultimate goal of German dominance. Economic exploitation would be systematic and comprehensive. Cultural elimination would be pursued wherever German planners deemed it necessary. Whether this order could have lasted is uncertain. History suggests that empires built on force and exploitation eventually collapse. But the process can take decades or longer, and in the meantime, millions would have suffered under oppression. The political New Order Nazi Germany planned wasn't sustainable in the very long term, but it could have endured long enough to transform Europe in ways we can barely imagine and would find devastating to contemplate. Understanding what Nazi Germany planned for Europe matters not because the scenario came to pass, but because it reveals the nature of the regime and the stakes of the war. The Allied victory wasn't simply one side prevailing over another in a military contest. It was the prevention of a comprehensive reorganization of European civilization along lines that would have meant the elimination of entire peoples and cultures. The documents survive. The plans can be read. The political new order Nazi Germany intended to create was not a mystery. It was a thoroughly planned, systematically designed, and partially implemented program that would have reshaped Europe into a German empire built on slavery, cultural genocide, and racial hierarchy. That this order was prevented stands as one of the most significant achievements in human history.